making our way in.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, we are officially now streaming live on YouTube. Thank you. So I just wanted to, I'm just going to mute everybody real quick.
I don't have any, I can't see you.
You can't see me?
Yes.
Well, first of all, I'm not the important person to see, but if you're using a laptop, on the top right-hand corner, there should be a little picture with a bunch of squares, and it says view, and you can choose to view the speaker, and that would be just me.
You're beautiful.
So we're good?
We're good.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to mute everybody real quick, and you can unmute yourselves as needed. Okay. So I just wanted to introduce myself real quick. I'm Liz Hughes. I'm one of the VPs of programming for the Sisterhood board, and I'm so thankful that there's so many people here. We're here, of course, to discuss Michelle Cameron's latest book, Beyond the Ghetto Gates, and hear from her about her research and how she can create such a wonderful world. And in addition to writing Beyond the Ghetto Gates, Michelle wrote the historical fiction novel The Fruit of Her Hands, which is the story of Shira of Ashkenaz, which is who is the real life ancestor, or wife of the real life ancestor to Michelle Cameron. And she also is a poet. She wrote a novel in verse about Shakespeare, and she's a writing instructor. And I feel like I could go on and on about her many accomplishments. And she's a New Jersey resident, so that's always exciting too. And I think I'll let Michelle speak for herself at this point, because we all want to hear from her. So whenever you're ready, Michelle, take it away.
Okay, thanks so much, Liz. And I'm really delighted to be here with all of you this evening. And I'm glad to hear that a number of you are enjoying the novel or have enjoyed the novel. So as Liz mentioned in her introduction, Beyond the Ghetto Gates is my second historical novel and my third book. When I started writing, I had really no intention of becoming a Jewish historical novelist. In fact, my first book, which, as Liz said, was a verse novel about William Shakespeare and the Globe Theater, never even mentioned Shylock. So there were absolutely no Jews in that book at all. It was when I discovered that I could trace my family roots back to Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg that I embarked on writing specifically Jewish historical fiction. My mother had always said to me that we could trace our family back to the Middle Ages. And I have to tell you that, when I first heard this, I was extremely skeptical. I mean, you don't listen to your mother when she tells you things like this, do you? But in fact, it was when a distant cousin of mine traced our family genealogy in this large book that I discovered that what my mother had said was absolutely true. And of course, Rabbi Meir's story intrigued me to the extent that I decided that I would start researching him. And in doing so, discovered that I wanted to write about him and his family story. And that became The Fruit of Her Hands. In many ways, even though it was a family saga and there are plenty of lighter moments, The Fruit of Her Hands was a tough book to write because it depicts the rise of anti-Semitism in medieval Europe. And so it includes things like book burning, blood libel, torture, lots of hard moments to write about. So, but in many ways, that story belonged to me in a way that my love, and I love Shakespeare, and I loved writing that book, but it never quite belonged to me in the same way. And that's when I discovered my proper niche. But like I said, writing Jewish history can be difficult. We've definitely had a lot of troubled times haven't we? And so when I wanted to write my next book, I was bound and determined to find that rare, rare beast, a joyous moment in Jewish history. So I know some of you haven't finished the book or haven't started the book, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a recap. The novel takes place in 1796 and 97, when a 26-year-old General Napoleon Bonaparte was chasing the Austrians out of Italy, in effect opening up a second front against the Austrians. As he was making lightning strikes through Italy and is seemingly unstoppable, he first discovered that the Jews were locked behind ghetto gates in the harbor city of Ancona. And in a typically symbolic gesture, he dispatched his Jewish soldiers to demolish those gates. People often ask me why this episode and this fairly unknown moment in history. And I've done a number of these Zoom, presentations, and I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of people who actually know this history. I myself had no idea about it at all until I read Michael Goldfarb's book, Emancipation: How Liberating Europe's Jews from the Ghetto Led to Revolution and Renaissance. And if you want, more background, I heartily recommend that nonfiction history about the Jews. I remember specifically when he described how Napoleon was locked out of the ghetto gates and ordered them struck down, that moment said to me, there's a novel here. But in bringing the story to life, I knew I would have to enter the lives of those people who were affected by Napoleon's actions. And so Beyond the Ghetto Gates tells the story of two women, one Jewish, the other Catholic. Jewish Morel wants nothing more than to further her father's legacy and to work with him. But her mother and the city rabbi refused to allow her to do so, insisting that she should be married and become a good Jewish mother and housewife. Francesca, on the other hand, the devout Catholic, feels trapped in a marriage to an abusive and ultimately murderous husband. And she will become very important in the novel when she first sees a miracle portrait of the Virgin Mary in the cathedral on Ancona's mountaintop, and we will get back to that. As a historical novelist, I've been blessed by many discoveries, gifts really, in a manner of speaking, made during my research. People will ask me, how much research do you really need to do to write these books? And the answer is a lot. I'm in the process now of just having finished my typical 3 months of pure research for the sequel to Beyond the Ghetto Gates. And so this is, it's reminding me how much work you have to put into it. A lot of the things that I love to do is, obviously I buy books. You can see just a few of them behind me, but there are many more that I consult. I love to go to museums, particularly the Met, and stand in front of the velvet gate, the velvet ropes, and wish that they would let me into those rooms. They never have, but I can still hope. Or to go and, study the artwork from that period of time. I also, like to read contemporary fiction. And in this instance, it absolutely played to something that I adore, because Jane Austen wrote during this time period. And so I got to reread all of Jane Austen, and there was no greater joy than doing that. So as I said, I spent about 3 months purely involved in research, and that's the period of time in which I'm trying to get my arms around the events, but I'm also trying to find the all important story. How am I going to illustrate what actually happened during this time period? It can very much be a dangerous time for a historical novelist. We, almost without exception, we love research. And it can be sort of a rabbit hole that we dive down into and never want to come out of. That's one major reason why I definitely limit myself to 3 months. And then I start writing. But I have to say that every day I'm writing, I have to look up other things because I'm always coming across things that I don't know. And so I did research, even when I'm revising, I am still researching. And I have to say, I've never revised a book as much as I revised Beyond the Ghetto Gates. People also ask, do I have a set writing routine? And back when I was writing The Fruit of Her Hands, I did. I was working a full-time job. I had 2 young sons. My husband was getting 3, believe it or not, 3 advanced degrees, and I served as his editor the whole way through. So I was struggling to find time to write, and I decided that it was important enough to me that I set my alarm for 4:30 in the morning and got 2 solid hours done. I don't do that. I did it for 5 years. I don't do it anymore. But there are lots of times, my sons are grown and gone, and I have a job that allows me, and in fact encourages me to write. But there are days I still miss that discipline of getting up at 4:30 in the morning. But let's go back to Beyond the Ghetto Gates. So obviously in my research, I had to focus on Napoleon's military campaigns and his political maneuverings as he made his way through Italy. I placed the novel in Ancona, where I have, again, never been. But I did so because that was where Napoleon first encountered the Jews. And I read about certain things that happened in Ancona, including the anti-Semitic riot that actually did occur before Napoleon came there. So this was, all basic research. And one of the things that, I really am anticipating, although it hasn't happened yet, is eventually there will be that Napoleonic enthusiast, and there are a lot of them out there, who's going to read the book and come to me and say, that battle you got wrong. Hasn't happened yet. I'm sure it will. But, again, one of the things that I needed to do in my research was find the story, the plot line. And this is where research absolutely gave me 2 amazing gifts. The first of those was learning about Ancona's reputation as Europe's foremost ketubah makers. They were the world leader of ketubah makers at this point in time. And so, and I'm sure you all do know this, but a ketubah, of course, is a Jewish marriage certificate. They had some of the most talented scribes and artisans in the Jewish world, and they were producing these exquisite marriage licenses. They were the first to illuminate them, and I'm going to hold up an example here. And they had a very distinctive shape, what they call an oge arch, which is this arch at the top with a peak. I'm going to show you again another example. And the wonderful thing about these ketubot is that when I went traveling with my husband and sons, and we went to places like Toronto and Edinburgh, and even at one point the New York Public Library, and I would go into an exhibit of Judaica, and there would be ketubot in one spot, and I'd walk over and I'd look at them and I'd point and I'd say, that ketubah, that one came from Ancona. And I was 100% right every single time. And it was the shape that taught me that. So how did I use it in the plot? So Morel wanted to further her father's legacy and work in his ketubah workshop. And so again, she wanted to work in this purely male enterprise at the time, although as an aside, a lot of ketubah makers today are women, which is very curious considering that. But again, the rabbi and her mother disapproved of this. And her mother in particular wanted her to marry a wealthy man. So when Morel received a proposal of marriage from her best friend's father, who was a very wealthy man, her mother was all for it. Now, as 21st century readers, we often look at the disparity of age and go, oh, that's awful. How could that ever happen? But the actual fact is that what in Regency literature, any Regency literature you read, you learn that there were a lot of these marriages, particularly for men who did not have a male heir. And so at that point in time, it was widely accepted, even though Morel didn't like the idea. She grew to like the idea even less because she became infatuated with a dashing young French Catholic soldier and even contemplated running away with him to get married. And we're going to talk more about the problems of intermarriage during this period in a minute. The second gift of research was stumbling upon the miracle of La Madonna del Duomo. So Ancona laid claim to this portrait of the Virgin Mary, and there she is. And so what happened was that Francesca Marotti and her daughter Barbara were at Mass, and they saw the portrait turn its head and weep. Now, obviously, this sounds fantastic, but I have to tell you, I didn't make it up. Because there is a Vatican document that one of my students actually helped me locate that relates the story of the miracle and gave me the character of Francesca and her daughter Barbara. There is also, and I call it an anecdote because I really don't believe it, even though it was written up. There is an anecdote of how Napoleon himself, while he was looting the cathedral, and you have to understand that he, as he went through Italy, he, picked up treasures from all over Italy and had them sent back to France. So as he's looting the cathedral, the story goes, he came across the portrait of the Madonna, and he stared at it, and then something must have shocked him, because what he does is he picks up this gold cloth and he throws it over the portrait. That's the end of that story. But I can tell you, there isn't a historical novelist alive that could resist that. And I certainly didn't. But I have to also say that everything that happens to the portrait after that point was completely my invention, just in case you need to know that. While we're on the subject of Bonaparte, another question that I'm often asked is, why was Napoleon so sympathetic to the Jews? And I have a theory about this. He seems sympathetic at this point in time, but a lot of this came from Napoleon's far-reaching ambition and his belief in his own destiny. And that is huge for him. And so what he does is, in a manner that I think we can all recognize at this point, is he manipulates the press. And he makes himself into a hero And so the stories go back to France. Now, why the ghetto and why the Jews? You have to understand that during the French Revolution, the Jews were given citizenship for the first time in Europe, basically in millennia. And so he was doing something that was in keeping with the revolutionary tenets. And so I think he just saw it as an opportunity. Later in history, after he becomes the emperor, his attitude changes a little bit. He would have preferred that the Jews fully assimilate and just become Frenchmen. But that's outside the scope of this novel. The whole idea of the Jews assimilating versus holding on to their religious traditions was a very important part of the story for me. And it is something a theme that I've explored. I touched on it in The Fruit of Her Hands. I have another novel that is not yet published that I really explored it in great depth. But it really is one of the reasons I was so drawn to the idea of the Jews during the French Revolution. The ideas of the Enlightenment are, making their way through Europe. The Jews are influenced by them. They're starting to, act more freely. Some of them aren't. The rabbi in the story is sort of an example of somebody who does not want to change one iota. But it is definitely a dilemma. And I think it's a dilemma that as American Jews, we can all sort of identify with. How much do we, how much do we assimilate? How much do we become like our neighbors versus how much do we hold on to our religious traditions? This is especially true when you consider that Morel had this dilemma. Should she, do her family duty, marry this old man, David Morpurgo, who her mother wants her to marry? Or should she run away with her French Catholic soldier? Up until this point in time, intermarriage would have been, as marrying and keeping your own faith would have been impossible. And that's because marriages were always handled by the clergy. So you couldn't marry and remain, Jewish in this instance. Morel would have had to convert. But because the French Revolution threw out religion entirely, all marriage ceremonies were basically civil ceremonies. And so they could contemplate getting married. Now, Morel knew that even though this was legal, her family would never accept it. Certainly her mother would never accept it. And she would be an outcast from the society. The place of women in society during this period was definitely constrained, with some exceptions. And I think my character of Dolce shows how you can manipulate the system even while you're staying within it. But, if you want, like Morel wanted, to do something outside of the norm, it would be both an internal and an external struggle. And so this is something that I had her struggle with. Now, I have to tell you that Morel was a problem for me. The character of Morel was a problem because as an 18th century character, she probably would not act always the way I have her act. But the problem is when I started writing her, I made her a much more passive character. And my beta readers, my early readers read this and said, no. She needs to have agency. She needs to have, be proactive. You're writing for a 21st century audience. And that's kind of my problem. I call it my feisty heroine problem. I didn't want her to be a proto-feminist, But on the other hand, I definitely, I mean, you're the readers. So we expect certain things from the women who we read about. Um, the other thing that I wanted to do, and I did this with the characters of Francesca and the Jewish soldier Daniel, is I wanted to convey how difficult it is to overcome taught prejudice. Again, something that unfortunately I think we can all relate to all together too well today. The Jews and Catholics in Ancona lived separate lives before the ghetto gates were torn down. And so the resulting clash of cultures actually ended up in many ways being violent. And then, you know, it was toleration, but not entirely. So the questions that I'm trying to ask through the novel is, how does one transcend wrong-headed but deeply held prejudices that are sort of bred in the bone, that you learn from your parents, your family, your clergymen, your society? How do you get past that? And one of the ways I suggested in the novel was when Francesca, this highly pious woman, got to know Jewish Daniel and recognized, well, they told me he had horns. They told me that he would be terrible. He's none of these things. I will say, and I'm trying to be careful for those of you who haven't finished the book yet, I will say that there's a certain amount of complexity in this relationship. And I'll leave it for those of you who have read it, know where I went with it. Those of you who haven't, finish and you'll find out. And then finally, there's one theme that as I was writing the book, I had no idea would become so important to all of us. And that's the theme of social isolation. So here I am talking to you through the medium of Zoom. Thank God for technology when it works. But, you know, I think because of that, we have more empathy with the Jews of the ghetto who got locked behind these gates, you know, sundown every night and weren't allowed out until sunrise the next day. It was a very different type of social isolation. But I do feel that this is something that now we have a greater appreciation for, you know, being locked up, ourselves in our homes, them behind the gates. It's a difficult thing to deal with. So with that, what I would love to do is open it up for questions that you would like to ask me, and I would be delighted to answer.
Thank you so much, Michelle. If you guys wouldn't mind typing in the chat box, and then I can read some of them out, then we can have a little bit more of a mainstream way of doing it. Oh, I like our first question. Thanks, Judy. Any chance it'll be made into a movie?
Does anybody have any connections? I would love to have it made into a movie. And in fact, and I really need to print it out. I actually asked my son and his fiance to sort of cast it for me. But because I'm, you know, I'm older, I don't know who would be the right characters to play it. And they did, and I still don't quite know who they have, but they had a good time doing it. But yes, I would love, I actually think it would be a better mini series than a movie. But you know, anybody who has any contacts at the BBC or HBO or Stars, put me in touch. I'd love that.
That would be
I
awesome.
can talk to a friend. Ooh, Leslie, please.
I'm seeing another one saying, I see that you lived in Israel. Have you considered setting a novel there?
I actually, 2 of the 3 novels that I wrote early on, and thank God never got published because they were just not good enough, were in fact set in Israel. I was talking a little bit so a couple of things. I was talking a little bit about the novel that I have not had published yet. That I went all the way back in time and set it during the Babylonian exile. So there are definitely parts in Judea as well as that. My hope is someday that it is really one of the books of my heart, and I hope that will get published. However, the next novel that I'm in the process of writing now, as I said, is the sequel to Beyond the Ghetto Gates. Now, what happens next in Napoleon's life is he takes this very strange expedition to Egypt, and he leads his soldiers into Israel, and in fact gets his first military defeat ever at Akka. So there will definitely be an Israeli connection in the next book.
That's great. I can't wait for it. Going off of that, we've had a couple people asking, when do you expect the sequel to be published?
I have to write it first. No, I mean, usually it takes about, I would say, hopefully within 2 to 3 years. I have to get busy. I've literally retooled the first chapter today. I've already written the second. It will take some time.
Awesome. Now, so the one about the Babylonian exile, is that the next book to be published from you then?
I have not put that one back out there.
Oh, okay.
What happened was that my original agent had no enthusiasm for that book at all. And so she didn't, she shopped it, but she didn't do it with any excitement. And so I got a lot of rave rejections. But I'm kind of holding on to it. I want to get the sequel out, and then hopefully I'll get that one.
Will you come back to us after the sequel?
I would be delighted to come back.
We'll keep that in mind, Donna. Keep me on top of that. On that note, though, Michelle is very active on Facebook, and that's how I found out that she was even publishing a second novel, and that she's, here in New Jersey. So I said, oh, I got to get on this. So I've been waiting for this since like July.
Yeah, it's been a while.
So someone else is asking, is there any chance that your books, or specifically Beyond the Ghetto Gates, will ever be turned into an audiobook through Audible or something?
I actually know who's going to read it. It's an actress friend of mine. She just can't get to a studio right now, so it's being held up for that. But yes, it will definitely be a audiobook as soon as she feels safe enough to go there. Hopefully she can get in the back seat and make it happen.
Fair enough. Somebody is asking about Dolce. How would you describe her personality and what she's meant to represent?
Okay, so Dolce was a fun character to write because I know people like Dolce. The kind of manipulative, selfish, and yet seemingly on the surface to be very caring. I think if we're asking what does she supposed to represent, I think she does in fact represent how a woman could use the system to get what she wants anyway. And so to me, that was kind of what Dolce was all about. But one of the dark secrets I think most novelists won't tell you is how much they enjoy writing the really rotten characters.
I could definitely see that. Fun to explore. Somebody's asking about, as far as your writing process, do you pretty much lay out the plot in advance and fill out the details, or are you not sure where the plot is going as you go along?
So this gets into something I teach I teach this series of aspiring novelist classes, and I teach them about being pantsers versus plotters. A pantser is someone who gets up in the morning, has a scene in their head, sits down, and just writes it. A plotter, Plotters, is someone who has to get everything down on paper before they write. My son, the young man I dedicated the book to, is an amazing plotter. He once wrote a book about an imaginary kingdom, and he wrote the Wikipedia page, so he'd know all the details. I actually fall in the middle. Obviously, I'm a historical novelist. There are certain events I have to get to in my novels. But often what happens is I'm not sure how I'm going to get from moment A to moment B. And that's where my being a pantser a little bit works. This morning, for example, I discovered that a cannon, which is going to be loaded on the ship, falls into the water. I didn't know that yesterday.
Someone else is asking, what was the name of the nonfiction historical book that you mentioned in the beginning of the presentation?
So it's called Emancipation. It's by Michael Goldfarb, and he did a really wonderful job of explaining, not just the Jews of France, but beforehand and also after. Yep.
Great. And Lois commented that she enjoyed reading the book, especially because she speaks some Italian.
Oh, nice.
So it's fun.
So,
I like how you sprinkled those, words in there as well. More
well,
often.
I have to say, I don't know Italian at all. So I relied on Google Translate, and then I took the book to a native speaker because I wasn't going to embarrass myself by getting the context wrong. So I'm glad. Apparently, you didn't find anything that I goofed with.
Was there truth in the character of the rabbi actually threatening Muriel's father to not marry people who got their ketubah from the family business? If Muriel
No, totally made up. But I tried to think of what could be the worst thing possible that, the rabbi could hold over the family. And so that's what I came up with. The rabbi, by the way, I know that he's not a likable character, but he's got a problem, which is a lot of, the Jews in his particular ghetto are being more and more attracted to these ideas of the Enlightenment. And so he's reacting with blinders on. So, I have no sympathy for him, but I understand him.
This might be a little bit of a spoiler for people who haven't finished the book yet. But why did you decide to let Muriel's brother and father both die? And then there's a second part to that, if you want to answer one at a time.
So I needed to show how absolutely high the stakes were for the Jews of Ancona, which is why I first had the brother killed off. Nothing would say it as loudly as we've had someone who was killed. The father, I felt, in order to, he was somewhat timid, but also he appreciated what his daughter was doing in the workshop. And I felt like he was a little bit getting in the way of moving the plot forward. And I had, that's kind of why he died.
The second part of that is, how do you think those losses helped or hindered Muriel's personal development?
Well, I think it gave her more of a dilemma in terms of what decisions she was going to make. Was she going to, throw it all over for love, or was she going to stay around and be dutiful to her family? She made some promises over her brother's grave. And so, that was going to add to her internal agony in trying to make these decisions.
And somebody's asking, will Daniel reappear in the sequel? He seems like a character who could be explored further.
He will definitely appear in the sequel. No question. Daniel will, Christoph will, Morel will. So you're going to see a lot of the same characters coming back.
And was it always the plan for Mirel to end up independent?
Okay, well, that is a spoiler for people who haven't finished the book, but that's okay.
That's all we can do.
So no, it was absolutely not the plan. There were actually 3 endings to the novel, and I have to say, I rewrote the beginning of the novel probably around 5 times. I rewrote the end of the novel. I even lost count, but there were 3 basic endings. I'm not going to say what they are, but I'm going to allude to them. The first ending that I came up with, I was pretty pleased with because I knew there was going to be a sequel. Okay. And I gave this to my beta readers, and they all said, "What, are you kidding me? You can't end the novel like that." So I'm like, okay, all right. The second possibility, I didn't have enough time to develop. And the problem is that it's been mentioned earlier on, it's a long book. It was longer than what you got. My publisher has a word limit, 120,000 words, period, including beginning and back matter. That meant that at the very end, I had to cut 35,000 words out of the book. I always feel like when you cut words, it makes your work stronger. It did in this case too. But I just didn't have the time to develop the ending that was possibility number 2. So I mentioned Alex, my son, earlier. I was talking to him about this. I couldn't figure it out. And he said, okay, why don't you try this? So I always say to people who are, torn about the ending, blame Alex. It's his fault.
Does he know that you say that?
Oh, he does.
And which character do you most identify with?
This is tough because I think there are both pieces of me and pieces of my sons and pieces of people I know in a lot of the characters. Morel, for example, has this amazing facility with numbers. Anybody who knows me knows that I mess up numbers all the time. I'll send out dates to my students. We're going to start class on this date. And they'll say, wait, what? And I'm like, oh, I got it wrong again. So, but I borrowed from my oldest son, who is a mathematician and who has always had the passion for mathematics. So I borrowed that. But there is a lot of me in Morel. There is a lot of me, frankly, in Daniel. So it's hard to, because again, they're pieces, they're composites of people.
And somebody's asking if you could share a little bit about your Jewish upbringing.
Sure. So I was raised in the Reform. My parents took me to a Reform temple. My mother had been brought up not strictly Orthodox, but that was sort of her background. So when I came home one day and I said, you know what, in 2nd grade, I said, you know what, we're doing the Aleph Bet again. I know the Aleph Bet. Can I stop going to Sunday school? She actually said, sure. Girl shouldn't be bat mitzvahed anyway. That was my mother. So, excuse me. But we moved to Israel when I was nearly 15. And so one of the things I think that has been tremendously helpful is the fact that I finished high school in Israel. And in Israel, you get this deep dive into Jewish history that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And I always credit my high school principal, who was also my history teacher. And that was tremendously helpful. But, I identify as a secular Jew, but with strong, strong ties to the culture.
And how did you come across the episode with Napoleon and Ancona? Were you looking to write something in that era, or?
So again, this was straight out of Michael Goldfarb's book, Emancipation. I was playing with the idea of the Jews during the French Revolution. So I was looking for sources for that. But that just spoke to me. You know, it just said, you know, this is a great novel and nobody's written it. It bothers me.
And people are asking, who are some of your favorite authors that you could recommend to us?
So my bookshelf is always crowded with fellow historical novelists. I love the books of Mary Sherratt, of Stephanie Cowell, who hasn't published in a while, of C.W. Gortner. So those are just a few. But I'm also very taken with not any, but many Jane Austen adaptations. I'm forgetting the author's name, but there's this marvelous, funny book about Jane Austen in Boca, which is definitely not historical fiction. But if you're looking for a light, fun read, that's a good one.
And somebody asked, if you could meet any living author, who would it be?
Lin-Manuel Miranda.
I like it.
Yeah. No, or the young poet from yesterday. Oh my God, that girl just blew me away.
It phenomenal. And
Yeah.
to be that young and have that ability.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much. Is there anybody who has any other questions? If you guys want to unmute yourselves at this point, feel free.
Michelle,
Yes.
I had been emailing, texting you. Can you put your email in the chat so I can private to me?
Absolutely.
So I can send it to my friend in California with connections.
Love that.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Thank you. Got it.
Connections are always good.
Oh, he's got connections.
Thanks, Sherry.
Sherry, that should work for you. I'm really bad at reading. Liz has it as well.
Actually, I had another question, and I typed it in, but you didn't pick it up.
Sorry, Liz. But
That was the one about the miscarriage?
Oh, let me see. Okay, here it is. Yeah, there we go. In the scene where Mirella is bleeding, it seems like she was having a miscarriage, but she didn't realize it. So I guess, you wanted some more clarification about that, Leslie?
Right, because she had symptoms going on for a while that were more like being pregnant.
Right.
The fatigue, the swollen breasts, all that stuff that would have led you to believe she was actually pregnant. So then when she started to bleed, I had the impression that she was really having a miscarriage. Well, I'm an old retired nurse by background and had 3 kids. And so I had the feeling she really was actually having an early miscarriage. She just didn't realize it. And they just said, oh, she's late. She was never pregnant. And certainly that saved her reputation somewhat.
Right. Honestly, I kind of left it ambiguous because I was in Morel's head. And as you said, she didn't have the understanding to figure it out. So that's kind of why I left it like maybe it was, maybe it wasn't.
Oh, we're getting a little extra feedback here. Yeah, let's see.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry about that, guys. But anybody have any other questions? Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
Really my pleasure.
Great.
Okay.
Wonderful.
We'll
see you
thank
in
you
3
to the
years.
Sisterhood for the signed copy of the book. I read it up very quickly over winter break.
Oh, nice.
I enjoyed it so much.
All right.
Great
Well,
book. Thank you so much.
really a pleasure.
Thanks.
And Michelle,
Thank
we'll
you.
see you in 3 years, right?
Yeah, and hopefully in person. That would be nice.
Oh, yes.
That would be fantastic.
Yep.
That would be great.
All right.
Great, great.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
so much.
If everybody doesn't mind holding on for just a minute, we're just going to announce some upcoming Sisterhood programs, and I will hand that over to Mindy.
Yes, so this was fabulous. And we have a couple of other things coming up. The weekend of February 20th and 21st, we are having a pre-Passover Shabbat weekend. It's going to be the Shabbat service on Saturday morning, women-led. And on Sunday, it's going to be in the afternoon at 1 o'clock, a virtual cooking and baking, led by our Sisterhood board members, Adria, Holly, and Joyce, who are going to be featuring an appetizer, entree, and dessert, all KP, all cooked for Passover. So they'll be sharing the recipes and showing you how to make it. So go to Shabbat services Saturday morning, pre-Passover. You'll receive a blast for it soon, I believe, and there'll be an RSVP, but it is a free event. So hopefully we will see you there. And hopefully we will see you at more of these types of events. Love to get more authors coming. Michelle the book was fabulous and her talk was fabulous. So
Yeah, if you haven't finished reading it, make sure that you do. If you're still waiting for it from the library, keep waiting. Or if anybody's interested in borrowing my copy and they're comfortable with that, I can have that available for you guys to pick up.
And Eileen, you want to talk about Purim and just to inform people, the Purim baskets, not baskets?
Well, they got. Pretty good.
You're muted.
she's working on it.
Cheryl's unmuted. Cheryl, you want to speak for her?
What is it?
Oh, there she is.
Oh, go ahead, Eileen. Go ahead.
We're here. So hopefully all our congregants and staff have received our first email blast about Purim this year, Purim Reimagined. Since we cannot safely bag up thousands of pieces of Hamantashen this year and make all those boxes, we are going to do a more of a virtual where we're going to raise money to support Beth Chaim and JFCS's mobile food pantry. So we will fulfill the mitzvah this year. The Purim mitzvah is feeding the poor rather than feeding each other this year.
I like that.
Right. Thanks so much. I hope that goes very well. And I think it's a great idea. So we'll be ready for that too, right? Everything's all coming up.
And thank you, Liz, for arranging this. This
Yeah,
was
Liz,
really-
thank you. This is a fabulous program. Great book, great author.
Yep. If you love the book, I highly recommend the first one, The Fruit of Her Hands. That's what got me started on her stuff. And
is that on Amazon? Can we get that on Amazon too?
I'm sure it's on
okay.
Amazon. It's also, I know there's at least one copy in the Mercer County Library System if that's where you live.
Right.
But
and
all right.
What was the name of the first one?
The first book is called
I'm gonna put a link in the chat box.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Don't forget to sign up for the Congregation Beth Chaim on Smile for Amazon. That is a way that costs you nothing that supports a temple. So I gave you the Smile link.
Oh, cool.
Right? You get to support and you get to get a book.
And you should know that the rabbi that Michelle descends from was a really big macher in his time.
Ah,
really?
He's a really famous rabbi.
Oh, really? The one in Israel or where?
Familiar with the story of the Golem?
Yeah.
The rabbi of that story is that rabbi.
Oh,
and
really?
The
Wow.
Golem didn't really live, but he did.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it's about his wife and everything she does. It's really well written. It's really well written.
That's interesting.
So, all right. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to spend the evening with Michelle and all of us. And I hope everybody's doing well. I'll
Thank
see you
you.
guys soon.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Liz.
Take care, all.
Stay well,
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.